The streets are rough. You are 6 weeks out from your first show of 2019. First show, I don't know. Maybe I was a huge fan. 2011 was your last show.
Well done.
Yeah.
Yes, August 2011.
Yeah,
That's
well,
right.
yeah, I may have been there. You know when you were doing the most muscular pose, and I yelled, "Give him hell." That was me.
I'm so appreciative that you flew out from Toronto to Reno, Nevada, of all beautiful
Nevada.
places, to see me compete.
I had to. Yeah, I mean, I was inspired by the forums. You know, I wanted to see what the most muscular looked like in person. I just remember Eric one time. I forget. Oh no, it actually might. It's not pumping iron. I think I looked up Mike Katz, one of the bodybuilders, just like checking out the bodybuilders after the documentary. And one of the shows, because this is also the late '70s, right, where things are just coming to be. But you hear one dude when he's posing, just like whoa, like just wait, his excitement level. Like there's kind of like, yeah, man, like hey, like clap, clap, clap. You're doing great. Like, wow, that's dedication. You built a very aesthetic physique. And then there's the level of, it's like almost, I don't want to say fangirling because that's the incorrect term, but like where you'll see like a celebrity, like where you just lose yourself. You lose, just yourself as a person. It was great.
It's the guy who was like, hey, did you guys paint your faces for the bodybuilding show? And they're like, that's not really a thing for a bodybuilding show. And he's like, we can make it a thing. Like, yeah, that guy was definitely in the audience, for sure.
That guy wanted to turn it more into performance art, which, interestingly enough, Eric, I'm sure you know this, that to help raise funding for Pumping Iron, and of course we are Iron Culture, so we're going to explore the history of lifting culture. I believe Arnold and Frank Colombo and a few others. I think Zane was Franco Colombo and Frank Zane. They did a posing show was it an art gallery? Do you know what I'm talking about?
100%.
Yeah.
And if I recall correctly, it was Arnold, Franco Colombo, and the late, great posing man himself, Ed Corney, who is known for his very elegant posing. He just recently passed away, unfortunately. I think it was the three of them. I don't remember if Zane was involved, but I know it was definitely those three.
Yeah, no, just fascinating stuff when we talk about what is aesthetics or like defining a bodybuilding of the goals that we have. Might be a good segue. I'm not going to give you my same 8-year-old Stand By Me story, which was great, and we lost from the podcast because we had to record the intro a few times. A good segue, because today we're talking about something a little different. We're talking about carbohydrates, a carbohydrate performance roundtable. This one is going to be pretty damn informative. We're filming this and recording this after actually recording the podcast episode, and I was amazed at the depth of knowledge brought forward and the amount of context, nuance, and then customization to what they're saying, Cliff and Danny, how they applied it to those listening. And so for the people listening right now, you're truly in for a treat.
Yeah, it was really cool to have them both on, because I think most of the discussions around carbohydrate are argumentative, or they start from a position of authority, either pro or con. And this was really cool because both of them are practitioners who have been in the game a long time and who are engaged with the research. People might know Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition Radio, and he's been in contact with the literal who's who of the nutrition science game. And so he's highly intelligent, highly well-informed, but he's also been a sports nutritionist for numerous numbers of combat athletes, powerlifters, and general pop for years. And Cliff kind of has the clinical side of it, where he very early on, when it was much less accepted, saw some of the potential clinical benefits of low-carbohydrate diets for treating certain conditions. He talked about epilepsy. He talked about his own experience with Crohn's disease, and discussing the utility in people who are perhaps more carbohydrate intolerant. And we can discuss some of those terms like insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. But yeah, I think it was a really nuanced discussion that allowed us to talk about the entire spectrum, from weight loss to performance to your average, not even average, but to your kind of lifting general fitness population, all the way to the clinical side of it. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how everyone responds to this and what they can take from it.
And I think that's, you hit the nail on the head. That's something that when people listen to this episode, they're probably, if you're someone, maybe you listen to Eric, you might think to yourself, oh, low carbohydrates, it's not really an option for me. I'm a lifter, and I train 4 to 6 hours a week. I need those carbohydrates. I need to feel it for my workout. Cliff gives a very interesting perspective where we all joked, he described that lifters aren't serious athletes in the sense that the total amount of hours that they train compared to an endurance athlete is different. And we talk about that idea of depleting glycogen, how it's not really there. I think if you come in with some preconceived notions, you might leave this podcast a little bit more aware of how context is very important for the individual and customization. Before we get into the episode with these two giants, I want to just give some definitions to the listeners so we're all on the same page. First, Eric, to get super basic, can you just define what a carbohydrate is?
Absolutely. So it's one of the three macronutrients between carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And it is the fuel source we use for higher intensity physical exertion. It is primarily there to fuel us. We store it in the body in both the liver and the muscles.
Yep.
And it can get depleted relative to our fat stores pretty quickly. Even someone who's 5% body fat, eating nothing and just having access to water, could still live for weeks and weeks and weeks before they actually died of starvation. But if, let's say, we couldn't mobilize body fat and we had to live off of just the glycogen in our bodies, we'd make it a day or two.
Right.
So carbohydrate is present in terms of the real world in grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and in starchy and fibrous forms. And it is primarily really important for athletes, and then conditionally important for other folks, as people will find out as they listen.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have the definition of carbohydrates. Can you talk then a little bit about low carb and ketogenic diets and how maybe they might not necessarily be the same thing, but people throw that out there. Oh, I feel a lot better when I'm on a low carb diet, or since being in ketosis, my energy feels a lot better. What is then, if carbohydrates are pretty damn important for performance, what is then a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, great question. And there's not necessarily agreement on this. If you look at traditional sports nutrition research, anything below 40 or 45% of calories from carbohydrate is considered low carb. But if you are in the bodybuilding sector, that's just kind of considered a normal intake because typically with the protein intakes we set, being roughly a gram per pound is kind of like the most commonly cited thing. And then having a decent fat intake because, testosterone, hashtag, is kind of the way most people think. Man, your carbs are typically going to be between 35 to 55% in almost most lifting circles. And that's actually considered skirting low carbohydrates for general sports nutrition. Now, if you were to look at some of the diabetes research and a low carbohydrate diet, the distinction is typically based on whether you're actually getting very low carb or ketogenic. And ketogenic specifically refers to a carbohydrate intake that produces at least 0.5 millimoles of blood ketones, right? So, and that is typically defined as being at the very highest below 100 grams per day, or more typically below 50 grams per day. And very low carb, high fat diets are typically 60 to 80% dietary fat, with the rest being split between carbohydrates and protein, and sometimes even limiting protein because there is an insulin response to amino acids, which can raise blood glucose, drop ketone levels, and kick you out of quote-unquote ketosis. So the definitions are by no means hard lines in the sand, but typically when we're talking about a ketogenic diet, it's something that produces over 0.5 millimoles of blood ketones in the body and are typically defined as carbohydrate intakes under 50 grams. Those are probably the most common definitions. But low carb could be anything up to 40% of calories from your diet in a sports nutrition context.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, Eric, before we go on from the ketogenic diet, what are ketones then? When you said you need 0.5 ketones to be classified as being in the ketogenic diet?
Right. So it's really important to be distinct about what we're talking about. So nutritional ketosis just means that for non-clinical reasons, you're producing a certain amount of ketones as a fuel source. And it's really important to note that having ketones present in your body is totally normal. And everyone is producing some amount. Even if you're on a moderate or high carbohydrate diet, some point between meals or while you're asleep, your ketone levels will get close to ketogenic. And we even talk about this a little bit towards the end of the podcast, where Cliff says, if you're using a targeted approach, you're taking in carbohydrate at certain times where it's going to get stored as glycogen or expended during exercise, and then you're fasted for other parts of the day and you go long periods of time without eating. You by your blood work, even though you're eating, say, 200 grams of carbohydrates, you might actually be in nutritional ketosis. So in the absence of exogenous glucose that's taking in carbohydrates, your body still needs brain fuel, and your brain can fuel itself off of ketones, and ketones are basically the partial breakdown of fats. And there are also some amino acids which are considered ketogenic amino acids. So it's essentially our body breaking down fats and protein into a fuel source that we can use to fuel all tissues and maintain blood glucose levels. Because that's something that's non-negotiable in the body. We have to maintain blood glucose levels at a certain level or we'll die. And our bodies are incredibly efficient and very metabolically flexible. So that's why you might hear someone say carbohydrates are non-essential. And that's technically true. The real question is, are they optimal if we're going to be talking about body composition, weight loss, fat loss, performance? So yeah, you can absolutely survive on a zero carb diet, and there are some cases where that might even be fine, or very low carb diet. And the reason for that is because our body can produce ketones from the protein and carbohydrates we eat, and still fuel all our tissues sufficiently.
No, and Eric, I think that's an excellent point. Something that Danny mentioned during this episode is how there's kind of three different camps when thinking about macronutrients or carbohydrate needs, and one would be health, the second would be body composition or body recomp, and then the third would be athletic performance, and how they don't necessarily intersect, and it depends upon what your goals are or what you're looking when determining your carbohydrates. The last few definitions I want to go over before we begin this podcast, because it is a monster, would be insulin resistance, Cliff mentioned, and then something called insulin sensitivity. Can you define those two terms?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways to define these. And so being insulin resistant basically has to do with your response to eating carbohydrate. And this is sometimes defined by HbA1c, which is a marker for insulin resistance or sensitivity, or your baseline glucose levels, or some more nuanced versions actually looking at baseline insulin levels. So there's not a completely agreed upon way of defining someone, but typically it has to do with your quote-unquote metabolic health. And there are relationships between the insulin response to carbohydrates, your baseline level of blood glucose, HbA1c, and I would say the majority of studies, but not all, as to how effective a weight loss protocol will be based on whether you have a higher proportion of carbohydrates or fat. And there's a fair amount of data showing that people who are insulin resistant, they do not respond as well to higher carb diets and typically do better with a higher proportion of fat, not necessarily ketogenic. We're talking like some of the foundational studies on this are 40% fat versus 20% fat, and those being equally effective when grouped by insulin sensitivity by one of those markers that cuts it off. And it's unclear at the moment whether that has to do with adherence, because whether or not you are quote-unquote metabolically healthy, part of the response to what you eat has to do with how satiated you feel, the hunger response, and those insulin curves do play a role there. And and in someone who is metabolically healthy, an insulin response typically will make you feel full and sated. And someone who might not have a quote-unquote normal insulin response to feeding, that may not be the case. So whether it is an actual physiological response to the food you eat, which influences how well you partition calories, whether you're gaining body fat or losing body fat effectively, or whether it is influencing your behavior or some combination of the two, I think we need more research on. And it may be that while it does seem to be one of the things that plays into it, we're still looking at other things. Like, for example, Cliff has done some preliminary research where you're your lipid panels might predict whether or not you should be on a higher or low carb diet. So essentially, when we talk about insulin sensitivity or resistance, it's a catch-all phrase that gives us some indication of whether or not you would respond better to a higher or lower carb diet. And just before anyone freaks out and goes, "Oh, am I insulin resistant or sensitive?" Most people who are insulin resistant are typically overweight or obese or have a genetic history of being pre-diabetic or having diabetes in the family. So that is something where, if you're a normal body fat young person who exercises regularly, there's a very, very low chance of you being insulin resistant or sensitive, which is one of the reasons why there's not as much intersect between clinical body comp, at least body comp outside of working with changes in the obese or the overweight, and sports performance, where typically in like physique athletes and performance athletes, being insulin resistant really isn't a thing unless there is some genetic anomaly or outlier going on.
Those are fantastic definitions. I think now that everyone has those in their head, we can begin this episode. Like I said, I do feel that this is a monster episode. First, because bringing together these two individuals and Eric giving some insight to this, I like having a open, honest conversation that isn't dogmatic and also isn't based on, kind of guru worship where it's like, well, I have this position, therefore I can't change, or that it's not, as you said, kind of context specific. If we're talking about body recomp or composition overall and physique athletes, that's going to differ greatly than, an individual that gets seizures, that suffers from epilepsy. And people don't take that into account, I think, when having these discussions. So I want to thank both Danny and Cliff for being on this episode. This is Iron Culture Podcast. I hope you guys enjoy it.
So thank you both so much for coming on. I'm sitting here with Danny Lennon and Cliff Harvey. First, I think it would be really good just for those who might not be aware of who you are, and shame on them all, for you guys to give a brief intro of yourself, only as it relates to carbohydrates. Any more than that will not be tolerated. So Danny Lennon, tell us about you.
I'll do my best to keep it brief. From an academic standpoint, I have an undergraduate degree in biology and physics. From there, I didn't mention before that I went and taught those subjects for a year in a high school in Ireland before going to do my master's degree in Nutritional Sciences, which was kind of my real kind of passion, I guess. And since 2013, 2014, I've had a company, Sigma Nutrition, the goal being to put out educational media content around nutrition, mainly through our podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio, where I talk with researchers, practitioners, and so on, as well as doing like seminars and conferences, etc. We also have a coaching side to the business. So I have 3 coaches that work with all sorts of clients, from Gen Pop to athletes in various different sports. As a practitioner myself, most of the past number of years I've been working with combat sport athletes, so professional MMA fighters, professional boxers, then judokas, BJJ players, taekwondo athletes, and so on. And so I suppose when we're talking about carbohydrate for performance today, some of it will be relative to those types of athletes. But yeah, just a general interest in nutrition all around has probably led me down some rabbit holes of different areas that will probably crop up today.
Yeah, one of those rabbit holes being what you presented on while we were just in Gold Coast this last weekend. You talked a lot about carbohydrate periodization, specifically for the athletes you work with, and some of the concepts like train low, sleep low, and manipulating times when you're intentionally low carb and then intentionally high carb to try to get some of the kind of the have your cake and eat it too, if you will, aspects of some of those muscular level changes and metabolic changes,
right,
which we can definitely get into. So it's an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, man.
For sure. Cliff Harvey, my friend, tell us a bit about your background.
Well, it was back in the late 90s that I got kicked out of nutrition class at university for questioning the kind of high-carb dogma at the time. I didn't come to that sort of position just to be contrary. It just didn't seem to mesh with the emerging research at the time, particularly higher protein. It wasn't necessarily that I was that interested at that stage in keto per se, but obviously the reevaluation of the role of protein in the diet just didn't leave enough room for the amount of carbohydrate that we were being told to prescribe, right? So it just didn't make mathematical sense. And when I asked the inconvenient questions, they said, well, you've done enough to pass, so we're going to give you a pass on this course, but don't come back, which was pretty rad, because then I could go surfing and continue to read all the early sort of research on high protein, low carb, and then keto and stuff like that. And so from there went on to begin prescribing and working with ketogenic diets. I actually, having said that, I tried my first ketogenic diet as a high school athlete about 24 years ago, so it's even longer than that. But went on and used ketogenic and low carb diets with a range of clinical patients. Also worked with a lot of high level athletes, world champions, Olympic, Commonwealth Games athletes, professional fighters, and things like that, using a spectrum of lower to more moderate to higher carb approaches depending on the individual. And I guess now that's where, as going full circle back into the same university as an academic now, having done my master's in medium chain triglycerides and ketogenesis, doing at the time the only research that had been presented on the keto flu, for example, and then moving into doctoral research in carbohydrate tolerance. We're really looking at what I call the carb appropriate spectrum, which is really trying to determine what level of carbohydrate an individual should be on, but also probably more importantly, what predictors can we find within the individual, biomarkers and things that can help predict what level of carbs that person should be on. So it's not about all, low carb all the time. It's basically about finding the appropriate diet for the person's outcome.
That's a really good lead into what we hope to talk about today, which is rather than should we have carbs in our diet or should we not, but what is the appropriate intake and why for certain individuals. So I think it might be instructive to start on kind of one extreme end of the spectrum and talk about what is the ketogenic diet. Where did it come from? How old is it? Is it a fad? Because I think it's very much perceived to be a fad today. And what actually defines a diet being ketogenic? So Cliff, could you chime in on that?
Yeah, so really it's a proxy definition based on what achieves ketosis. And what ketosis actually is still relatively undefined, and that's often a surprise to people. If you actually look for evidence for what nutritional ketosis is, you'll come up with, I think, 5 papers now, 3 of which I wrote. And so there's not a lot of definition there, but we do have a lingua franca that's over a certain level of beta-hydroxybutyrate, that main ketone, which is 0.5 millimoles per liter. So basically any diet that can achieve that is by definition a ketogenic diet. But the exploration into it started really about 120 years ago, when they started noticing that kids with epilepsy, and obviously there were versions of the diet previous to that, but when people really started looking at it mechanistically, they found that kids with epilepsy were getting better seizure control when they were fasted. But obviously you can't fast someone forever. We need to eat. And so they started looking at the macronutrient profile of what these kids were eating and what they needed to withdraw to get the same seizure control. And they found by practically eliminating carbohydrate and then providing really high levels of fat to provide fuel, these kids were getting those seizure control results. And so there was a sort of proxy, again, rationale for ketogenesis, which was to reduce seizure control. Reduce seizure activity. And to achieve that, that's why ketogenic diets for a long time were quite extreme, because we needed to have quite high levels of ketones in the blood to have the optimal seizure control in the acute stage. Now, of course, there's a much bigger spectrum of what we would consider to be a ketogenic diet, and it can be achieved, very variably by different individuals. And we've, got a paper coming out on that very shortly. And so really, it's not a fad, because what we're beginning to see is there's a big spectrum. Like with carb intake, when we got into this in the 90s, we were basically thinking about it in the same way that Dan Duchesne and guys like that thought about it. It's like an on-off switch. You're not in ketosis or you are in ketosis. You're not producing ketones or you are, but that's rubbish, because everyone's producing ketones all the time. And so everyone will be, on a standard American-style diet, producing maybe 0.1, 0.2 millimoles, right? You get incremental increase the more you reduce carbohydrate. And so I find that spectrum of keto is equally as interesting as the spectrum of carb intake that someone requires for the best benefits.
Well said. That's a really good kind of lead into us now talking about why there is value in utilizing carbohydrates that are appropriate for your needs. So Danny, I'll kick it over to you. And and I first let me know if you agree with this, but I'd say in the last maybe 10 years, the general sports nutritional literature has shifted from, hey, all athletes should be on high carb diets, and the question is how high,
Right.
to more of, hey, carbohydrate periodization, or like some of the IOC papers talking about, hey, there's a time and a place to be higher or lower carbohydrate.
Right.
And that's been an interesting shift. So from a sports nutrition perspective, what's going to dictate the macronutrient breakdown for an athlete? And should all athletes be on high carb diets, or is it more nuanced than that?
Right. So you make a couple of really good points there. One, this kind of old thinking of someone is an athlete, therefore they're on a high carbohydrate diet. And even beyond that, presuming that every day they need to eat high carbohydrate diets. Whereas now we've moved to number one, what type of activity is the athlete doing? And then even for one individual athlete that could compete in a sport that benefits from high carbohydrate intakes, that may not mean every single day is a high carbohydrate intake day. And so Professor James Morton, who's based in Liverpool John Moores University, has had some really nice phrases that I think speak to athletes as well on this. So rather than being low carb versus high carb, he says it's about being smart carb, which is kind of a colloquial term for what we see as periodized carbohydrates now in a lot of research papers. And so it's looking at, can we look at what is the intensity and duration of certain training sessions across the week? Where do you need to be fueled up in terms of full glycogen stores to compete well? What sessions maybe you don't need that requirement? And then is there a time and a place for restricting carbohydrate purposely? And so now there's probably a few different components. There's one, on a sport-to-sport basis, there will be different requirements based on the demands of that sport. Two, then there will be differences on a day-to-day basis within that sport, depending on the training schedule. And then three, probably one of the most interesting areas, is on an individual athlete basis, their response in those certain training sessions could be very different. So again, James Morton, who I had the chance to talk to, gave a great example from an elite sport level where he's worked with Team Sky. He's been in charge of nutrition over 5 of their Tour de France wins. And so he was talking about how pretty soon after working with them, he started to notice when they were doing like their physiology testing and trying to see what different athletes were responding to, he could see some of their riders, sure, within an hour and a half into a long ride would need to be consuming some exogenous carbohydrate to keep fueling at the appropriate pace. Someone like Chris Froome, who ended up winning the Tour de France multiple times, was able to go for a 6-hour ride without needing any exogenous carbohydrate at that particular time. So you see these differences just genetically and so on. And some of that is trainable as well. We can probably get into that. But you see those differences again on a sport basis, the types of sessions then you're doing, the individual athlete, and as we'll probably come to, even the goal of those sessions isn't always necessarily performance.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not always trying to fuel for how to perform this particular training session as best as I can. We could have a different goal. We can accept some decrement in performance perhaps to get some other beneficial adaptation that later will hopefully pay some reward.
That's a really interesting perspective, kind of how things have changed. So I think, Omar, this is interesting for us because probably where carbohydrates are debated a lot is in a sphere where it may not matter as much, into like the general lifter fitness field.
My glycogen's being depleted, bro. I just did 3 sets of curls.
Exactly. We're not talking about people with epilepsy. We're not talking about cyclists. We're talking about people who probably train 4 to 6 hours per week on average, are generally young, reasonably normal kind of body fat. They're not hardcore athletes, and they're also not people who have very specific needs. I know. I just broke the hearts of 95% of people.
I'm a recreational powerlifter, and I'm offended.
Yeah, I just find it ironic that bodybuilders and powerlifters spend a lot of time, and they're recreational and competitive, kind of debating this stuff, when in reality, even though lifters are pure anaerobic athletes and primarily utilizing the ATP-CP system and some glycolytic systems, but really the total energy expenditure is quite low, and they're probably in a position where they have more quote-unquote flexibility with what they can do than most other athletes.
Yeah.
So anyway, Omar, I just thought it was funny. Do you see that a lot on your channel and with your people as well, talking about like, well, I don't know, what kind of carb person am I?
Oh, well, it's interesting that you say that, where you're talking before, Danny, about Tour de France athletes doing endurance-based activities. But we'll see on, my channel or just on Instagram. And now recently, I do want to ask you, Cliff, a question about the carnivore diet just quickly afterwards. But there's a whole bunch of people leaving comments how, oh, my glycogen's depleted, or, I need these carbohydrates to fuel my workout. Like I can't do my 8 sets, which amounts to probably 2 minutes of total work without crushing some carbohydrates before my workout. So I think a question that I would probably have for Cliff, talking as it relates to lifters, when you talk about the spectrum of the ketosis or the ketogenic diet or carbs in general, if you could comment specifically how it relates to these lifters, or maybe some of our audience, the core people that will be watching that aren't doing endurance-based activities but are doing these short, intense lifting activities. And then also, maybe the first question, though, however, is the ketogenic diet just basically people that aren't man enough to do the carnivore diet? Can you just comment on that a little bit? Or no?
Well, I think a lot of carnivore people would claim that. It's interesting, though, the carnivore diet is, I find it really interesting because, at first glance, it's crazy. It's ridiculous. First of all, I would never, based on voluminous amounts of evidence, think that a vegetable is bad for you, right? Mm-hmm. That's crazy to me. However, there are people who really do appear to be thriving on a carnivore diet. Now, I don't think in reality most people actually do a carnivore diet. Most people that I know who follow carnivore actually add in some other things, some fermented vegetables, some pickles, things like that. So it's not really truly carnivore. But I think it does throw up an interesting area of research in that if we exclude all vegetable matter from the diet, does that actually change our requirement for vitamin C? Does the, inhibitory effect of glucose on vitamin C uptake have any effect? All these sort of unanswered questions. My, foundational stance, though, is that we're omnivores, straight up. We've eaten vegetables for a long time. All of the cohort evidence and observational evidence, I know people say it's just observational data, it doesn't mean anything. Well, do an intervention study for 50 years and tell me when you've done that.
Yeah, guess what? Your anecdotes about the carnivore diet are also observational. Yeah, exactly. But they're not even studies. So,
but, if we have basically every observational cohort showing us that there's pretty much a linear association between vegetable intake and health, I'm going to take that as a given, right? Plus, I think most of us would notice that we feel better eating vegetables. Now, if some people don't, I get it, because there are clinical states in which vegetables are going to be problematic for people. But I think it's a weird space. I think it's super interesting. I think we need to actually do more research in it, because I think it'll help to flesh out our understanding of what the human body requires. But, the safest, most effective position for 99.9% of people is eat your fucking vegetables, man. Right. Seriously.
Yeah, I think for me the interesting thing is there's definitely people seeing some benefit, like you say, when they exclude a lot of plant matter from the diet. But probably what I would hypothesize is that they're eliminating something from the diet that is causing an issue rather than the inherent benefit of eating just mainly red meat, right? So exactly. We could tell them to eat the salmon diet, right?
Yeah.
Or eat any diet that's reducing this high fiber intake that they're maybe having gastrointestinal distress from. And once you take that away, they're seeing benefit. So it's maybe a fact of the restriction. And again, it's just the most extreme form of a typical elimination diet you would see in immunology, rather than this being this new kind of holy grail, I guess.
There's something that Eric and I have talked about a lot, which is the idea that what you're doing now to get maximal benefit is not what you need to do forever. In fact, it might be counterintuitive, or counterproductive, I should say, for what you want to do long term. And I think a great example of that is the FODMAP diet. It works, it's clinically effective, it's clinically proven. There's no doubt. It reduces the symptoms of IBS.
Just for our listeners, can you define what the FODMAP diet is?
Sorry, so the FODMAP diet is a FODMAP-restricted diet. It reduces the amounts of fructans, oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monounsaccharides, and polyols. So it's basically all of those disaccharides and other types of carbohydrates, particular chains of carbohydrate that are easily fermentable in the gut. So you can see that
That are very present in a lot of plants.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And so you imagine that those foods, because they're fermentable, they're going to contribute to gas and pain and bloating. However, the later research showed that it's self-limiting because you go off those things initially, you reduce your symptoms, but over time you're going to get deleterious effects to the microbiome. So your gut health is not going to be good in the long term. So, and I thought that from the very beginning. I wondered, is this really a good long-term strategy? So when I ever did apply the FODMAP diet clinically, I applied it for a very short period of time, we're talking about weeks, and then started to slowly introduce fibers again and titrate the dose up to help the person's gut improve in terms of the microbiomal status. And that had a much better result than having someone on FODMAP for a long time. So I think that you're probably seeing the same thing with carnivore. It's just the most extreme form of exclusion diet you can possibly have, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I have two thoughts that very much echo what you guys say. And one is based on evidence that's in the literature, and one's based on my observations as a bodybuilding coach. The one based on the literature is that if you go from eating a balanced diet to the carnivore diet, you're probably going to be in a calorie deficit because you're not just removing fruits and veggies, you're also removing your main carbohydrate sources. So it's unlikely.
And more protein.
Yeah, you're kicking up your protein and you're dropping your calories. And we've seen time and another 10 times on top of that again, that's going to improve at least in the short term, your profile when you look at it metabolically or in terms of a health
or
panel.
your profile when you're standing on your side.
Absolutely. It's going to get you shredded too, bro, which is what matters. And now to kind of coincide with that, as a bodybuilding coach and as a bodybuilder myself, what invariably happens when someone is dieting through the phases of prep is that not only does their total food intake have to go down, but their proportion of starchy to fibrous carbohydrates changes. And you get to a certain point where your fiber intake, even though your calories are, say, 60% of what they were in the off season, your fiber intake might be 160% of what it was in the off season. And there's definitely a point where bloating, gas, discomfort, and feeling crappy on that diet happens. And I think it's independent of the fact that you're dieting and shredded. And I do think that there is probably, we know there's such a thing as too much fiber. And certain types of fibers can actually interfere with nutrient absorption. And for sure, if you're creating all these short-chain fatty acids and a ton of gas and bloating, that's going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so amazingly, like everything, there's probably a sweet spot of moderation where an appropriate intake of vegetables is right. And what we're probably looking at is people doing the carnivore diet are extreme personalities. So if they were following
You think?
Yeah, exactly. So if they were following a diet before, you bet it was pretty hardcore. It might have been super, super clean too. So they were probably eating an incredibly high intake of fruits and vegetables, perhaps even too high, probably only things like brown rice and oats for the carb sources. They cut it all out and feel massively better. And that's something that I've seen among bodybuilders when they switch from a very clean approach to more of a little more relaxed, if it's your macros approach, where they're still getting in a serving of vegetables and fruit per day. But, you know, I've had bodybuilders who are natural, who look like they have a GH gut. Yeah. And you look at their diet, and they have a fast metabolism. They burn a lot of calories. They're active outside of the gym. They're on 600 grams of carbs, and you find out that almost half of their carb intake is from oats, and the other half is from vegetables and fruit. My God, can you imagine the machinery, like the peristalsis power they have? You know, and then when they start throwing in things like frozen yogurt and like some foods that are a little easier on the gut and just with a lower fiber, all of a sudden their waist shrinks even though their body fat stays the same. And I've seen it multiple times. And I think that just probably speaks to some of the anecdotes that we're seeing in the carnivore community.
Yeah. To jump in on that and to take us maybe on a bit of a tangent, but it kind of seems to echo a lot of what we were seeing in like 2013, 2014 when the gluten-free diet really kind of hit its peak of its powers, right? And at that point, I think it became abundantly clear that there is this non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And so people saying you only need to avoid gluten if you are celiac, that's clearly wrong. But on the other end, we still see it's a small minority of the population.
Yeah.
And a much smaller amount than what, at least anecdotally, people seem to suggest of, look at all these people who take wheat and other grains out of their diet and have these benefits. And again, it's not the question of did they have a benefit or not. The same way it's not a question of did someone benefit from the carnivore diet. It's why did that happen?
Yeah.
So sure, it could have been the gluten, or it could have been that restriction of grains led to them reducing FODMAP. intake, so that improved their symptoms. It could have merely been a placebo effect. Or kind of flip side of that, there's also this kind of nocebo kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of I go on this gluten-free diet, and then after a few weeks, I'm going to test out to see what I'm like. I go eat full pizza and wash it down with a beer. Look, I feel terrible. It must have been the wheat, right? And I think the same thing can happen if you're so bought into something, you can almost placebo yourself that you feel good, and then nocebo when you go test it.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting when we're in that space as well, because it's very easy for people in the performance realm to, well, first of all, we've got the worried well, right, which is I think what you're speaking to predominantly. Right. People, we certainly see non-celiac gluten sensitivity. I think that's beyond a doubt. However, it's not with the same prevalence that the early research indicated, because that Monash stuff came out and showed that was probably mostly to do with FODMAPs and things like that. Right. But because of the dispute around that, I think you have people in the performance and particularly aesthetic circles who will say, oh, well, it's all bullshit, and we'll just go back to that proxy position of you don't need to reduce gluten unless you're celiac. But, being in the clinical realm where I'm dealing with people with autoimmune conditions and inflammatory bowel disease and things like this, when you review the research, it's actually pretty clear that there are certain things that work really effectively, like reducing dairy, like reducing gluten, like potentially reducing some other grains like corn and oats and things like that. And it's because they have the highest allergenic potential in the human being, right? And you see it consistently across basically every autoimmune condition. So the point there is that if we're only framing what everyone should do based on our particular state or method, we miss everything else, right? So I think that's why it's really interesting to sort of have a foot in both camps, both for performance and clinical, because I think that's where the coolest research happens, because that's where money is. Yeah. Money's in clinical because drug companies fund it. Money's in sport because sport's big business. And I think getting different perspectives gives us a really good idea about what could work for mainstream pops as well.
Right. So the ability to look at both those lines of research gets us kind of both ends of the spectrums of really what's kind of the outlier. So I guess to carry on to the second part of Omar's question, although we had a really awesome tangent off the carnivore,
absolutely,
is what are the realistic carbohydrate demands of lifters, recreational lifters, people who are training either for strength. They probably follow their Instagram feed, probably has a few powerlifters who are big names, or a bodybuilder, someone who's following some of the popular Instagram models, or maybe they're fully into it and they're following some IFBB pros. Like, what kind of options does someone like that have as far as carbohydrate intake?
Man, so there's a few places you could go with this. I think one, kind of going back to what you previously said, of guys who feel that I'm going to train today, so I need a ton of carbohydrates. I think a lot of that is probably psychologically driven, just by messages they've previously heard, or have maybe again noticed that they felt a bit worse on a day that didn't have a huge high carb meal. And I think maybe some of it could be psychological. I think the aspect of like how much carbohydrate do they need, you could probably look at it in two ways. One is how much carbohydrate is actually being used in that session that they actually need to make sure they have. And as I think you've already pointed out, it's probably pretty low when you look at the amount of even glycogen that gets used in even a pretty intense weight training session. Is going to be nowhere near depletion, maybe like a 40% drop at a really tough training session.
At most. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So like that's the upper limit of what you're probably going to see. The more part of pragmatic question is there a benefit beyond that of just having more carbohydrates around for other reasons apart from the glycogen availability? So even though you might not run through all your glycogen stores, having full glycogen stores for that lifting session, will you get some sort of inherent benefit to how it feels? And there's some stuff maybe about when you have some degree of glycogen depletion that might affect your RPEs, for example, and how the kind of session might feel. Or just how, again, another psychological aspect of when someone's going in with like full glycogen stores versus feeling a bit flat and depleted. So there's probably two aspects of how much carbohydrate is actually being used, but also then is there a benefit even beyond that of just having a high amount of carbohydrate around?
Right.
Yeah, I think, Danny hit the nail on the head, and I think first and foremost, I think we need to look at those types of sports and look at what athletes are doing within them, because it's really different. You can have a world level powerlifter training 2 to 3 times a week, like a Mark Chaler type person, and then you can have others training twice a day, 6 days a week. The energy requirement for those two athletes, although they're in the same sport and competing at the same level, is completely different. We see the same thing in MMA. Some people don't have the same recovery ability, and so they train, once, maybe twice a day in a camp, whereas others will be doing 4 to 6 sessions a day, kind of thing. And the energy demands of that are completely different. But one aspect of what Danny said, which I think is really interesting, is the intangibles, tangibles and intangibles on top of that.
The qualitative aspects of it, yeah.
Yeah, like how do you feel? What can you stick to? Like that's critically important, right? I dig low carb, and the reason I dig low carb is because I invented it. Noted. The reason I dig low carb is because I have.
You just got kicked off of Rogan.
Things. I've got Crohn's disease.
He said you just got kicked off of Rogan. So
I have Crohn's disease, so it's an inflammatory condition. And I find when I avoid grains, legumes, things like that, nightshades, I just feel a heck of a lot better. And I've quantified that for myself because my inflammatory markers go through the floor, and my rheumatologists are just blown away, right, when they look at the levels of inflammatory markers in the blood when I'm on keto, for example. The problem is, when I'm training as much as I am now, which is not a huge amount, but it's 90 minutes, 6 days a week, I can't eat enough when I'm keto because I'm too satiated. And we've talked about this before as well, right? In order for me to eat enough to just get the calories in, it's not about the fuel, because I could get the fuel, I think probably I'm on the cusp there, but I could probably get the fuel being low carb, but I simply don't get in enough total quantity. So adding some of those carbs back in is critically important. Plus, of course, I think, we've all discussed before the anabolic effect of carbs.
yeah.
I mean, I've tried like hell in the past to prove that, but, self-experimentation, prove that you can get #gains keto. And it's just not as easy. For 99% of people, it's just not as easy. No matter, what some of the people say out there who are real keto gain zealots, I just don't believe it's anywhere near as easy. And there's a whole bunch of functional rationale for that and structural rationale for that.
Yeah, and I would say that's actually very recently, has been replicated and shown in the literature a number of times. There's a handful of studies now that have shown you can maintain lifting performance while going on a ketogenic diet. But when you look at some of the outcomes as far as muscle thickness or total lean body mass, there's a study that came out just last year in powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters where they actually saw losses in muscle thickness. There's a study in CrossFitters where they saw some decrements to lean body mass of the limbs, if I recall correctly. And there was another one that I think it was more related to their inability to get into a surplus, like you alluded to, by Vargas and colleagues last year. We covered it in mass, where the group that was on a keto bulking diet didn't gain body weight or lean body mass.
Right.
So, I think there are probably mechanistic reasons as to why that could perhaps interfere with the muscle building process. I'm not saying completely turn that switch off, but maybe inhibit it. But it also seems like, we've got a fair bit of data now. I'm aware of 2 studies that would suggest there's an independent effect of being on a ketogenic diet beyond the high protein content that typically comes with it, that shows people typically are, at least for a period of time, not going to eat as many calories. There's this initial inhibition of hunger. And that could be related to trying to adapt to new diet. It could be psychological, but it seems pretty consistent enough that I would bet there's actually some things going on physiologically.
I wonder about the overall effect. I think that's certainly true for individuals, but I wonder about the overall effect. We just published that paper a couple of weeks ago, and there was very little difference in sort of calorie change between a 25%, 15%, and 5% carb allocation. Very little difference in any of the sort of macro allocations outside of obviously carbs. There was obviously a shift in fat, but protein was controlled, and obviously the very low carb group did better overall. And I think that just mimics what we have seen in the body of research thus far, and I'm probably going to get strung up for this, but I do think if we just look at it on balance without getting into the nuances of why, although that's important, I think that carbs obviously are important for hypertrophy. and low carb outperforms high carb for fat loss in the short term. I think that's fair enough to say. Now, I don't necessarily think that always applies to physique or power athletes because they're a different set of people. But when we're looking at the research that's been performed mainly on obese people, mainly overweight people, I think that's certainly true. So I think it still applies to a good proportion of mainstream people who are interested in aesthetics. Mm-hmm. So you feel free to shoot me now.
No, I actually want to hear your thoughts on that, Danny. Do you largely agree with that, or?
For body composition, I think, as Cliff said, it's pretty clear if you look at particularly trials of around like 12 weeks, say plus or minus 4 weeks, you do see, if you go and look for trials showing a benefit for people in the low carbohydrate group of a particular study, there's plenty that show increased weight loss, increased fat loss. I think the important thing, particularly if we're talking about bodybuilders or people who are just more generally paying attention to the details of their diet, is you start to see those things washed away when you match for calories and protein in those studies.
Yep.
And so, again, it throws up the question of if you're controlling for those, that's one question. Two is pragmatically, what is the effect of telling a general group of people to go on a low carbohydrate diet? As we've already alluded to a few times, you tend to see this slightly increase in protein, at least initially, because of the food choices it imposes. That will come along with increased satiety, typically. Also, you're restricting the amount of foods available. And if you think of most hyper-palatable foods that people can overeat on, they will go out the window if someone's on a very low carbohydrate diet. So those two modifiers will, just from giving that advice to go on a low carb diet, will probably reduce in more of a caloric intake. And so those changes are due to them just being in a bigger calorie deficit than the other group. In any of the trials,
consistent calorie deficit
right,
as well.
Yeah. over
it
continued
improves
period of
adherence
time.
because there's less margin for error when you've got less opportunities for mistakes.
Right. So I do think one important trial probably to point out from the past year, pretty much about 12 months ago, I think it was published, the Diet Fits trial that Chris Gardner's group put, and we can probably get into some of the aspects of that. But that was one of the kind of longer term trials, 12 months, where you had groups kind of low carb versus low fat, based on initial restriction, but then allowed them to titrate up their intake, which is probably an important point to that. So that wasn't necessarily set up to look at differences in body weight per se. It was more looking at certain genotypes and insulin secretion and how that would affect people's response to these different types of diets. But we see similar weight loss over that period of time on both those groups. And that would kind of is consistent with other areas we see, even down to some of the highly controlled metabolic ward studies, I think like Kevin Hall's work and so on. So I think there's probably an interjection that you'd like to add to that. But I do think overall it seems that once calorie intake and protein intake is controlled, you see a lot of those inherent benefits for fat loss specifically kind of wash away.
I think the Diet Fit study was so important because it was a big study, it was a long-term study, it was an intervention study, it was really well funded, it was really well performed. I think, though, that it's like any study, it has some limitations, and I think one was that it compared a fairly modest, what worked out to be a fairly modest restriction in carbohydrate. And I think that's important because we still don't know really the difference in different types of low-carb diets. And in the systematic reviews that have been performed where they've looked at subgroup analysis past 12 months, and they haven't just compared high-carb versus low-carb, but they've looked at very low-carb versus other types of low-carb and high-carb. Very low-carb still has outperformed the others for weight and fat loss. I think the most interesting thing from the Diet Fit study was most people have sort of looked at that and thought, well, there's basically no difference, so low-carb sucks. When I look at it, I think, well, there's very small differences. So what that shows is that the most important thing is eat a good, healthy diet because they set it up really well. It was getting them to eat a good diet.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at clinical markers of which have really strong predictive value for later outcomes, I think it's still important to recognize that triglycerides, HDL, BMI, things like that were most improved by low carb and significantly so, like particularly for HDL and triglycerides. BMI approached significance, and it was really interesting with some of the outcomes that were presented. They didn't actually give the p-values, and I retroactively looked at them, and they were still kind of approaching significance there. So I think on balance, we would say odds against chance, if we were to say which one was better from diet fits, it's still low carb. Like, again, hang me up, because it's not a big enough effect size to probably worry about. Because I think over time, if you can stick to a good, healthy diet, that's the most important thing,
Right.
99 times out of 100. But if we're just looking at the data itself, low carb still outperformed the higher carb diet in that study.
You know, I personally wouldn't disagree with you. To me, I think the quote-unquote elephant in the room is a low-carb diet is inherently more restrictive than a diet that allows carbohydrates, especially the lower carb you get. And
You know what I'm going to say, though, right?
I do. I know exactly what you're going to say. And I think more importantly, though, and I'll of course let you say it, is that then brings into question, when is that trade-off worth it? And for which types of people? And I think that's where we might need to cross into the sector of psychology and eating behavior. So first, I'll let you say what you wanted to say, Cliff, and then I kind of want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, obviously one of the things that I often do hit back a little bit about, and it's not because I'm into low carb per se. I mean, I really just want to figure out more about this stuff. But I was actually surprised when I looked at the research and found that the systematic reviews of this topic show that adherence is probably better for low carb. However, again, if we dig down a little bit deeper and we don't just take a sort of martyr position here, the subgroup analysis probably shows that's due to people who are more metabolically disordered, people with insulin resistance and stuff like that. They adhere better to low carb than high carb typically. So I think that's interesting, because to me that does speak to the ideas of what we saw in our qualitative research, for example, is people get compendia of food. They can sort of relate to, okay, I'm just not going to eat this stuff. It's like that idea that abstinence is easier than moderation for a lot of people. However, I do want to throw in a tangent here, because I saw a really cool thing. It was on the Subversity blog. He reposted one of the recent studies where intermittent ad libitum feeding had better results than a straight calorie restriction. So in other words, it's kind of like going back to the old days of Dan Duchaine's cyclic ketogenic diet and the sort of carb cycling you're sort of talking about and things like that. That's rad, right? Because if people can find a strategy, whether it be low carb or high carb or whatever, that works well, but also they have the opportunity to exercise unrestricted dietary freedom and get better results, that's exactly where I want to be myself, and it's where I think most of my clients want to be. That's cool.
Yeah, that's a really, I love that you said that the goal should be to eventually get to a point of unrestricted dietary freedom. Not operating based on, hey, I have to eliminate a food group because if I do eat it, it gets out of hand. Not operating based off of, I have a fear of certain foods. And getting to the point where you can essentially moderate your own intake. And I think that's what I want to get at, is that one of the potential rationales, and I would say diet fits, though it's a bit of a wrench in this, but I'd say on balance, overall, if we look at some of the data collectively on like insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity and what's probably most appropriate, it does seem that there are certain people who will do better on a low-carb diet than a high-carb diet. And importantly, really importantly, insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance is not a permanent stamp on your genome that you're always going to have. So wouldn't that imply that if you are insulin resistant, and even let's say you are more of an abstainer than a moderator, and you do great on a low-carb diet, I would say from a clinician or coaching perspective, I would like to get that person both psychologically and physiologically to a point where we can reintroduce carbohydrate and have a more balanced diet.
Yeah.
So would you agree with that?
100%. I think that's critically important, and I think about it in terms of there's this idea that we either have dietary freedom or dietary inflexibility, and those are pretty arbitrary definitions. I think what has benefited most of my clients over 22 years in practice now is basically exercising freedom within structure, and I think that's where treat days or ad lib days, whatever you want to call them. I don't like cheat days because I think it's negative framing. Although I had one of my students came from a gaming background. She's in tech. And she said, I love the word cheat day because for me, a cheat is like cheating the game and getting better results. And that was rad because that showed that what doesn't work for 99% of people really worked well for her, just in terms of framing. But I think if we can take that positive approach to this and have freedom, but also have almost the minimum amount of structure that we require to be compliant and to actually get the results we want, that's kind of the holy grail, right?
Yep.
So if we can find that, and of course it's going to shift over time as well, but if we can find that, that's really where we want to be for having that dietary flexibility you talk about.
Nice.
I think it speaks to that. Most of the discussions around like creating adherence with certain dietary patterns is almost not a nutritional consideration, right? That it's the type of the diet isn't what's driving it most of the time. It's that is probably a proxy for something else.
Yeah.
And so when we look at like the Diet Fits trial that we bring up, that for a long-term free living study like that had like really high adherence to the diet. But when you look at how that was done, they received like a ton of counseling throughout that particular study, every couple of weeks, being able to have sessions with a dietitian and be able to talk through what they were doing with the diet. And you see that in other areas that in the low carb area, the Verta Health trial that came out, again, wasn't a like RCT in the kind of traditional sense, but that had like pretty profound changes in being able to almost reverse some of the issues people were seeing with prediabetes and diabetes. And what you see part of that program is not only the high amount of support that those people are given, but you're almost self-selecting for highly motivated people who want to make that change. And those things are probably more important than the type of diet each one of them ends up getting assigned to, I think.
That speaks to a really interesting point as well, I think, in that, you've obviously looked at the Verta stuff and seen some positive outcomes from that in terms of what we can translate into practice. I think that's so critical to do with any study that comes out. Look at the study, read the study, and see where that might have application for you to grow and evolve in your clinical practice, right? Rather than looking at it and just reading the conclusion and they say one particular thing, you say, well, I don't like that, so I'm going to basically write off the study. By going back into the methodology and saying, oh, well, you had X amount of dropouts, or you didn't do it the way I would have done it, you didn't control for this, you didn't control for that. Because at the end of the day, a great example of that is the study that came out. It was very similar to the Pure study, the ERIC study, came out and basically said, low carb will cause early death, right? When you actually look at the data, it didn't really show that. What it confirmed is that the people eating a compendium of closer to unprocessed food did better, irrespective of whether they were high carb or low carb, because the low carb, the lowest carb cohort were pretty much not eating vegetables. They were low carb was basically burgers and pizzas and stuff, right? So if you actually look at the food questionnaires that they were administered and the results from those, you start to see, hey, there's actually some really important information to come out of this. So, I was a bit disappointed in, my colleagues who are more on the low carb end of the spectrum, who came out and just slammed the study in absolute terms and said, well, it shouldn't have been done, it was a terrible study. Well, no, it wasn't a terrible study. If you're going to say it was a terrible study, you've got to say the Pure study was terrible as well. Let's instead look at what we can bring out of those that can inform our practice and our further research, because that's the important shit. Let's get above all this high carb versus low carb stuff, because it's not helping. You can't tell me if you're a low carb zealot or a carnivore zealot, you cannot tell me that there aren't people out there who thrive on a high carb vegan diet. Yeah. Because there are. And I don't like a vegan diet for myself because it makes my guts blow up. But that doesn't mean I'm going to say to someone else who's running fucking ultra endurance marathons and just killing it, like, dude, imagine how much better you'd be if you'd be carnivore. It's like, that's dumb.
Yeah, aren't you a weightlifter with Crohn's disease like me? Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, unfortunately, Cliff, I got some good news and I got some bad news. And we're going to want some closing thoughts when it comes to all this, how to apply it for the individuals listening. But on the positive, you are the perfect Joe Rogan guest, where you're low carb before it was cool. You're a keto warrior before there was a distinction. You questioned authority in the late 90s with your teachers, which just shows that you're not for the corporate capitalist. You look like you're part of a... What's that?
I'm waiting for the bad news now.
Oh yeah, you look like you're part of maybe a Christian '90s rock band. Like you have all the things that MMA athletes. He loves MMA. All that. He's like, dude, in. But then the downside, you're too rational. Where it's a balanced approach to things that you're saying. Even we joked a little bit about just the carnivore diet, but then you went into it where different things work for different people. And I'm not trying to give a platitude when I say that, but in terms of how these are recommendations for the individual, really does come down to the individual. And I guess jumping on top of that, the question I'd have for those listening or those watching that are basically, as Eric said, not serious athletes. Which, I mean, to be clear, you're referring, like Cliff and Danny are referring to, like Danny was talking about cyclists, right? People that what's the average, Danny? How many hours a week does a cyclist train? Probably 30, 40. It's a lot of hours of work.
Incredible, yeah.
Yeah, so those are serious athletes. For those that are probably listening that are interested in body composition, that are interested in performance as it relates to strength, so powerlifters, weightlifters, that probably train 4 to 8 hours a week, they hear these things about insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. They hear about carbohydrates. Then from Danny, carbohydrate periodization. I want to start first with you, Cliff. Can you just comment in terms of adapting some of these strategies to the individual, and then we'll go over to Danny.
Yeah, definitely. I think the most important thing for, a recreational or even, competitive physique athlete, because typically the volumes aren't really high enough to justify having, a one-size-fits-all carbohydrate strategy. I think the key thing really is to get your protein sorted first. And then it does come down to some degree of experimentation. Now, I think in terms of prediction of carb intake, we're getting a bit closer, and we're about to publish a study where we present perhaps a baseline cardiometabolic profile of triglycerides and HDL and things like that. Might have some predictive value. But at the end of the day, if you can stick to your nutrition, that's the most important thing. So again, I would say set protein first, make sure you're eating enough vegetables, and then maybe modify your carbon and fat intake predominantly based on what you can adhere to. Now, if someone is like me, probably does a bit better off on low carb for a range of reasons, likes it because it's easy to adhere to. I'm definitely an abstainer, not a moderator. If I moderate carbs through the day, I overeat. It's that simple, right? If I don't eat carbs at all, I undereat. So what's the strategy there? I would be more inclined to probably maybe similar to what you do, Danny, I'm not sure. I really like targeted low-carb approaches. So I'll have extra carbs straight after training. Or I might occasionally do some carb backloading. Not because it's magical, it's not. There's nothing, crazy going on with your physiology there. It's just a way to basically have windows of opportunity where you can have those things. Plus, I really like that idea of having structure that allows you to comply and then have ad libitum days. I think that's really important to have those free days.
Cool. Do you want me to add to that?
Well, I think
a specific question.
Yeah, Omar's question is basically how do we get closer towards individualizing a carbohydrate intake? What are the answer is always it depends, but I guess in the case of the average lifter, what does it depend on?
So there's probably a few aspects, and I try and tease apart nutrition based on the differences between nutrition for health, nutrition for athletic performance, and nutrition for body composition. And I think they are often, not always, but oftentimes can be very different goals that pull you in different directions. And so I think if it's purely for changing body composition, maybe counter to what some people would typically promote, I think for the average person who's maybe lifting, let's say, 4 to 5 times a week, is based on what we said about the requirements for those training sessions. If are eating an adequate amount of calories for whatever their goal is, their protein intake each day is appropriate, they have that distributed across the day in a manner that we know is beneficial for muscle protein balance. And then as long as they're not restricting dietary fat to the point that's problematic or unnecessarily trying to cause stress by having to restrict carbohydrates perhaps for some people, the actual amounts of those I'm not sure are actually even that important. So I don't think it matters that much for body composition directly. However, I think for physique athletes, there are some indirect impacts of your carbohydrate intake. So one is, can your carbohydrate intake impact your actual training session quality? Because if it does, then it's easy to extrapolate out, okay, in the long term, this will have its impact on your physique if you're consistently training your performance. So if you find for you more carbohydrates allows you to consistently train better, therefore accumulate more volume and recover better, then in the long term, your body composition will change. So while it's not a direct impact, indirectly it could be doing so. Conversely, the same thing happens with your health. If you find there's a certain amount of carbohydrate that you get certain health benefits from, whether that's from more carbohydrates or carbohydrate restriction, if you are just by function a healthier person and feel better, then, and again, in the long run, indirectly, that's most likely to make you a better athlete / be able to make better change in your body composition. So that's where I think the interesting work is, not whether directly, if we match up calories and protein, is there these massive differences between slight changes in the carbohydrate to fat ratio, but more, how does it impact your performance and your health to the point where indirectly your body composition will change in the long term?
Yeah.
Yeah, well said. And I'll actually chime in a little bit because as I've gotten the opportunity to do some research in this area with my master's student.
You're the
Simon
only doctor in
Chatterton.
the room currently.
Well, technically, but I mean, that doesn't mean I know everything. It just means I'm a better person morally than you guys. Yeah. So.
And if we all had to escape
No,
on a
I'm
rocket
naturopath, so
ship, they would
that
select
means
you
I'm the
first.
best.
Yeah, they would select me first. In a sci-fi movie, I'm the only one who's going to live. You guys are just, sorry, not going to cut it unless you have the money. So you guys are both business owners. You might make it. But probably not, because it's a fitness business, so you're basically scraping together pennies. So anyway, so my experience as both a researcher and someone who kind of started with, I wouldn't say a high carb bias, because I would say a higher carb bias within the bodybuilding community, which is like 40, 50%, not like the 70% or higher. Come on, bro, get serious about your carbs. I would say having shifted from being much more kind of, I remember saying things that weren't truly evidence-based that sound logical back in the day, like, you go low carb, it'll shut down thyroid, or, you go low carb and your metabolism will suffer, or you go low carb and you'll get glycogen depleted, which isn't actually the case if your calories stay high, especially for the type of training that we do. Your body finds a way to maintain glycogen levels pretty impressively, which you've seen even in some endurance athletes and some surprising work out there. So a lot of the rationale that I used to have around why it's terrible to go low carb related to glycogen, thyroid, etc., it just doesn't exist anymore. So now I've gotten the opportunity to play with, all right, if we've got some ranges, well, what's an appropriate constraint range? And then unfortunately, because we have wide ranges for the average lifter, that means you're going to have to self-experiment a little bit. We don't yet have the metabolic panels or the ability to get sensitivity to tell you exactly what it is off a few tests. So you're going to have to try it. And I think for me, what the underpinning value behind it is what carbohydrate fat ratio makes it easiest for you to hit your target calorie intake.
Yeah.
So exactly, right? So we're saying, right, calories are most important, but simply telling someone eat more, eat less can be very difficult if they're in a certain setup. So there are times, I think, when someone's trying to maintain or just have a very slow gaining approach, where ironically it makes more sense to be on a more moderate carb intake and higher fat, because it's easier to get it in, you're less satiated, you're not eating just quite as many really filling fibrous foods, or vice versa, or even going quite high fat, low carb. And I think there's a lot of value in looking at that. One of the things that came out of Simon Chatterton's master's, and to give him a lot of credit, we didn't have enough data to publish it, and it was a narrative review, but we looked at the differences between low-carb diets and strength athletes that resulted in weight loss. So that's basically an ad libitum deficit, which is by definition typically a slight deficit, versus instituted calorie restriction along with a low-carbohydrate diet. And we found,
interesting.
Pretty consistently, when there was forced calorie restriction with a low-carb diet, there was pretty obvious detriments to resistance training performance.
I've got something really interesting. We recently we did a study a couple of years ago on MCTs, And it was the first one that looked at MCTs in the context of a classic keto diet, right? Because that might surprise you, but previously all the research had been done on a classic ketogenic diet, which is a 4-to-1 ratio of fat to non-lipid macros, or in other words, 80% fat plus, compared to modified MCT diets that were typically around 60-odd% calories from fat. So we were the first to do an 80% diet, including MCTs versus a control. So it was a randomized control trial. It seemed like...
Real quick, can you tell the listeners what MCTs are?
Sorry, medium chain triglycerides are a particular type of fat that encourage ketogenesis. They increase your ketone levels, and so they've been used particularly in the early days in kids with epilepsy to get higher levels of ketones for seizure control, but now they're obviously used for a lot of other things, just to basically increase your ketones if you want to do that, to have some more of that ancillary fuel. And we found that there was a likely benefit to keto flu, right? The symptoms of carbohydrate withdrawal. In our recent study, we didn't see any difference between a 5%, 15%, and 25%. No real meaningful difference. There was a slight increase in the very low carb group, but between a 5, 15, and 25% carbohydrate diet, virtually no difference between them for these supposed keto flu symptoms. No association between any of those other factors. There was, however, a strong association with how much they calorie restricted. Now, they weren't supposed to calorie restrict. It was, a unique study in that it was habitual calories. It was a eucaloric study. It wasn't designed for weight loss, anything like that. But those who did calorie restrict because they were satiated had the greatest symptoms.
Right.
So we're starting to think that there might still be a benefit of having higher ketones from MCTs or exogenous ketones or whatever for keto flu, but it's probably more a function of a relative energy deficiency, which I think is what we see for anything else. I've been active against these people who are saying low carb is bad for women's hormone balance. And I say, yes, it can be, but typically it's not, because the studies you're using to back up that contention don't show that at all. They're not low carb. They're extreme calorie restriction. And I think we all understand that extreme calorie restriction or extreme lipid restriction or extreme carb restriction, if it leads to calorie restriction, are negative for mood, are negative for those symptoms of carb withdrawal, are negative for hormone balance.
Yeah, on that, I'd be interested to ask your thoughts, because with this whole carb flu that people have anecdotally talked about for quite a period of time when someone goes on a carbohydrate restricted diet, one of the variables that seems to be related to that is electrolytes, potentially, or at least is being hypothesized to be an issue. And so, again, this probably speaks to the difference between a low carbohydrate / ketogenic diet and versus, as like a broad term, versus how it's actually formulated. Like, there's two ways to do it, right? Just don't eat carbohydrates, but your food quality is still really poor, versus something that has a bit more attention to detail, and potentially first, I'd like for your thoughts on the electrolyte issue, and then secondly, is that low caloric intake or the greater degree of calorie restriction maybe also a proxy for lack of certain electrolytes being in the diet?
Absolutely, I think it's both. And one of the things that isn't understood at the moment is whether it's actually being on a very low carb diet, in other words, being in a ketogenic diet, versus just a drastic enough carbohydrate restriction that you have, pretty drastically reduced insulin levels for a period of days as well. And whether that is the impetus for that increased loss of water and increased loss of potassium, increased loss of sodium, right? Because that's what we're probably thinking. It's actually any drastic carbohydrate restriction will do that, whether it's from 50% down to 25% or 50% down to 5%. Because we didn't really see any difference in those symptoms there. And the magnitude of those symptoms was so much greater with a calorie restriction. So I think there's a number of things in play. I think a lot of people have really simplified the supposed keto flu down to keto diets and electrolyte loss. I think that's obviously a big part of it. But I think it's also to do with energy deficiency, and that's probably why, that the magnitude of increase in ketones that you get from MCTs or exogenous ketones really seem to help as well. Cool. So I think it's a combination of all those things. I think it's transient fuel inavailability. I also think it's that diuresis, caluresis, and natriuresis, so that sodium, potassium, water loss.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's really, really cool stuff. Yeah, it does totally make sense. And I think we've now covered kind of a bit of the gambit of, high performance sport. And high, I should say, I made the joke that lifters aren't serious athletes. They take their goals seriously, and I'm allowed to say that because I am a lifter, so I can criticize my own people. I think that's what I've learned from humor in the 90s. You're allowed to do that. Is that...
this episode's going to be called 90s and Carbohydrates in the 90s.
Carbohydrates in the 90s, that's perfect. Yeah. So I think we've covered the gambit from high-performance, high-energy expenditure athletes who are going to need some range of moderate to high pretty much all the time. And it's a question of when, why, and how, and for what purpose, with maybe some individual differences at times.
Yeah.
All the way to clinical conditions that require or benefit the most from a low-carbohydrate diet, to fat loss, where especially in people who are with obesity or with overweight, who have metabolic issues, they might benefit, at least initially, from a low-carb diet. And then all the way to kind of the physique community. And there's a different answer for each one of those.
Yeah.
Which I think makes sense. I think that might be a little intimidating or disconcerting to the average listener because it doesn't give them a clear answer. So I think what might be useful for us to kind of maybe finish with is some basically no-goes. And I would say I think we're all pretty much on the same page that if your goal is putting on muscle mass in the most effective way possible, you probably don't want to be on a ketogenic diet.
Yep.
It doesn't mean you can't be on a moderate carb diet, but I would probably recommend somewhere at least in the range of, say, 2, maybe 3 grams per kg as kind of a low end.
Or you'd want to be applying carbs to your ketogenic diet.
Right.
Now, I think that's... I don't want to throw a spanner in the works, but I think that's probably an area that you work in a lot. I know it's an area that you probably, delve into a lot with your physique athletes as well. Is one of the big challenges we have at the moment is... you take cycling as an example. There are athletes out there who are low-carb athletes, but it doesn't mean they're not using carbs, right? You got someone like Dan Plews, Dr. Dan Plews, researcher. He's a mate of mine. He just killed the Ironman record, right? Destroyed it. He's a low-carb athlete. He lives low because that's what works best for his fat adaptation. It improves his RER and all that kind of stuff. But he takes a truckload of carbs during the event, because he's basically manipulating his machinery so he can burn fat more effectively. But there's no way his glycogen's going to last for an Ironman event, so he's using it there. Similarly, I think a lot of powerlifters, martial artists that I work with, they will apply carbs at certain times, like straight after training. So even if they might be functionally keto, because they measure their blood ketones in the morning, they're in a state of ketosis, but they're still having quite a lot of carbohydrate. I did that little self-experiment, I think you remember, where I was eating, 200 grams of carbs a day and still getting into ketosis every day.
Oh, yeah.
And interestingly, a mate of mine sent my little results up to Stephen and Jeff Follick, and they said, that can't happen. It's like, yeah, it does.
That's impossible.
It does happen.
Right. So that's an interesting way of looking at it, is because 200 grams of carbohydrates is right around 2 to 3 grams per kg for you, yeah? If I did my math right.
Yeah.
So but there are large parts of the day where you are ketogenic. So you could call that a ketogenic diet, but not a low carb diet, just to make things really confusing for everyone. Thanks a lot, Cliff.
Well, adding to that, a lot of my CrossFit athletes, when I measured them, they were consistently around 0.4 millimoles of beta hydroxybutyrate, right? 0.4 millimoles
paleo.
of They were paleo. They were lower carb than general population, but still eating quite a lot of carbs because it's a spectrum.
And high protein.
Yeah.
So that'll kick you out of ketosis a little bit too, yeah. Yeah, I think that's really intriguing. Is if you find, for all of maybe the adherence or the mental benefits, or when I say mental, I mean behavioral benefits, being an abstainer versus a moderator, that you can maybe maintain a leaner physique and moderate your total calorie intake better, being on a moderate carb intake or even a low moderate carb intake, but you also want to put on muscle, kind of a lean gains approach.
Yeah.
I think, a targeted approach of when you eat carbohydrates and then being somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 grams per kg is probably the most low carb I would go. Would you guys agree with that? Kind of the furthest you'd take it is to be semi-low carb or targeted with maybe slightly lower?
For carbs, I work on...
For muscle gain, specifically.
Yeah. I work on percentages with my clients, so mainly because it makes more sense for me to do that, right?
I agree.
If you... Let's say you have an athlete who actually you want to put into ketosis, but they expend 4,000 calories a day, it doesn't make any sense to say you've got to have under 30 grams of carbs.
Right.
Because they're just going to use up that carbohydrate, So they will still get into ketosis if they're on, let's say, 80% calories from fat and let's say 15 from protein, 5% from carbs of 4,000 is a lot more than 5% of 2,000.
Sure. Right.
Yeah, I wrote a post a few years back, and it was called "Is Low Carbohydrate Dieting Effective?" And it was basically just a way to get people in to point out the arbitrary nature of terms when people use them. So first, what do we mean by effective? Because that could be a number of things. And then secondary, what do we mean by low carbohydrate? And even when you look through the literature, there's like all sorts of different definitions for what constitutes a low carbohydrate diet in that particular study. And even when we're talking now in practice, the same thing applies. When we say low or moderate, that's, again, it's almost meaningless unless we zero in on the type of person. So again, going back to the cycling example, those Tour de France athletes, again, got a lot of, for some of their meals that they were posting online, it kind of blew up that, look, they're eating like avocados and eggs for breakfast. They're low-carb athletes. And then people started to realize, they have low, moderate, and high carbohydrate days. But because of the nature of like the 21 days of the Tour de France, their low carb days were 6 grams per kilo of carbohydrate. Right? On the top end, they were getting up to like 19 grams per kilo per day, which is incredible, right? So what their low, moderate, and high is going to be completely different to pretty much everyone else.
Right.
So, and that even goes down on an individual level of what type of athlete we're talking about, what exactly do we mean by low, and that will be a function of, again, of their overall energy demands, etc.
So my beautiful little fishies, I'm going to reel you back in. I'm going to reel you back in here.
If you want a clear target,
we're talking about, in this scenario of people, let's say, training less than 8 hours a week, which I think covers most bodybuilders, powerlifters, and recreational lifters as well. Maybe not all, maybe not during prep, maybe not during a volume block for a high-level powerlifter. And assuming not a construction worker job, and also not a completely sedentary job, maybe some sedentary jobs, that's more and more common. Would you guys feel comfortable saying you probably shouldn't be very low carbohydrate, which might be defined as, say, less than 30 or 40% of your calories, or less than 2 to 3 grams per kg on average? Is that a decent recommendation if someone's goal is muscle gain?
I personally would agree with that. Typically, and I think most things end up converging at the same point anyway, no matter what way you do it around. So for example, we might take someone and square off their protein intake number one, make sure their fat intake isn't too low that's going to cause any problems, and then let their carbohydrate intake fall where it's going to naturally fall. So someone with a bit more preference for carbohydrate might get up 3-4 grams per kilo. Someone else might be closer to 2, but it's pretty going to fall around that range you mentioned, depending on their, especially like their caloric intake.
Actually,
and so again, as they diet, their calorie intake is just going to drop anyway. So I think it's more important to keep above a certain baseline of fat intake, square off protein, and then the carbohydrate can be much more, fluctuate a lot more.
That's exactly what I do.
Yeah, that's actually what I do too. So I'm asking you guys a question, and that's not even the way I'd answer it. So I understand the hemming and hawing, because I would normally set it up, set protein, and then typically between, say, 15 to 35% of calories from fat, or as high as 40% of calories from fat if we have good data to show that you respond better on a low-carb diet, and then let carbs spit out whatever they end up being.
And that, my friends, is the definition of carb appropriate.
Right.
And that's exactly why I got kicked out of nutrition class back in the day, because I said, well, there seems to be a range at which protein is most effective for people, and it might be, 1.4 to 2.2 for performance, or it might be higher if you're dieting, things like that. But there's a sort of range there. So the way I looked at it, that's essential. So let's set that first. Then let's set a minimum threshold of fat to preserve hormone balance. And surely, based on their overall energy requirement, the carbs are going to make up the balance. I shifted a little bit, though, because for some of my clinical patients and things, it was more important to, and some of the athletes as well, to really encourage fat adaptation. But it's still the same process. It's protein. In these cases, it's protein first, then lipids, and still the carbs making up the balance. So either way, I think it provides a real amount of flexibility to macro prescription that's not dogmatic.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess that's actually a really easy way to do it for everyone listening who's thinking about, I go through phases where I'm trying to put on lean body mass. Sometimes I occasionally cut. If you know your energy intake and your protein intake, and then you can play with scaling your fat intake I would argue between 20 to 40% is going to fit most people, and then see where you feel best. And then whatever's left is your carbohydrate intake. And then if your surplus or your deficit is appropriate, you should be able to avoid those negative effects of low energy availability combined with low carb intake, or trying to be in a surplus but just not getting a benefit because you're way too low carb.
Right.
So I get nods from you guys. Agree with this?
I agree. I have slightly different numbers, but I agree. I mean, I set a minimum threshold of fat at 30%, and that was purely based on some of that early stuff which showed that under that, some people might be more at risk of hormonal imbalances or, challenges with that.
Yeah, it's funny. There's that research is interesting because it also interacts with the fiber intake of the person.
Yeah.
And there's also stuff on the total calorie intake of the
and
person.
And the carb intake.
Yeah, and the type of fat as well.
Yeah, no doubt.
And then on the other side of it, there's actually a study on hockey players, another one on cyclists, where the carb intake went too low and their testosterone cortisol ratio got out of whack.
Exactly.
Largely from testosterone going down.
Yeah.
So I think avoiding extremes on average is probably a good idea.
I agree.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think an
100%.
interesting tangent from that is, and people may have a question, which is the reason why I bring it up, of once you have those set, how do those change as you alter caloric intake, say as you diet? And so just on the kind of fat issue, I've tried to start setting it on like a grams per kilo basis, just personal preference wise. So for most people starting out who just don't know where to start, maybe like generally athletic, maybe they're, let's say we're taking the lifter example, let's go around a gram per kilo of body weight for dietary fat, and then your remainder is carbohydrate. From that point, when they start reducing those, again, it depends on the person. If it's someone in the general population, you may allow them to reduce carbs, fat, combination of both, just depending on their food preferences. For someone maybe in a contest prep, it's probably more important for that preservation of lean body mass and performance that I would say, okay, if we're starting out at like a gram per kilo, maybe we start reducing fat intake till it gets to maybe like 0.5 grams per kilo. We don't want to go too much more lower than that.
I would agree.
For any given person. Once it hits that, then don't drop it any further. Let's start maybe reducing carbs after that, to that point. Again, so for those isolated examples, it may change when you start playing around with calories.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that because it makes sense to me. There's no fundamental difference between what maintaining lean body mass is and gaining lean body mass is from a muscle protein balance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we are seeing pretty consistent data that like really low carb diets aren't ideal for putting on muscle, especially if we're talking about like bodybuilders, who that's everything, maintaining lean body mass. It's not like, resistance training and protein, that's going to cover 90% of it. Like, I want to get that last 10%. Then I think it probably does make sense to try to preserve carbohydrate if you can. And I will say unequivocally, there's not data on this. The closest thing we have is observational data showing that typically higher placing bodybuilders eat more carbohydrates and reduce their carbohydrates less. That could just be a function of them eating more calories. That could be a function of the genetics that lead you to be effective and nice and insulin sensitive, fill out nicely, maintain fullness. I don't know. But I definitely have seen low carb bodybuilders, but they're certainly far and fewer between than those who tend to have higher carbohydrate intakes. So I would agree with that, Danny, but Cliff, I'd love to know your thoughts.
I actually agree with you. I do think that there's so much more that we need to pass out there in terms of further research, and I do wonder whether, a diet that has an appreciable level of ketones is going to change that situation slightly. I do think that some of that muscle breakdown is likely to be due to just the base requirement for glucose. But where someone has an increased level of fat adaptation, where they have more glycerol being freed up from that, where they have increased ketogenesis, where they're potentially using things like medium chain triglycerides, I think it might shift the picture enough. But I think to say that it does would be just to fall into low carb zealotry, and I'm not prepared to do that. But I certainly do wonder, and I do have probably an underlying bias that I think for rapid fat loss and retention of muscle, I personally tend to go very low carb. And I've had some great athletes, natural Mr. Olympias and stuff like that who have done that. But having said that, they also set a foundation through their off season, which is very clean. They also eat a truckload of carbs, So I think here's a great example of variability. and I hope I'm not going too tangential here, but I had two Muay Thai fighters, both at World Championship level. One could not get lean eating carbs. He had to be low carb. The other one was ripped to shreds anyway. Dude was a stud, ate truckloads of carbs, ate a really healthy, nutrient-dense diet. There's no way I'm going to change that dude to low carb. But conversely, I'm not going to have the other dude eating lots of carbs because he just couldn't get lean. Now, one of the most fascinating things in that process was that one of the fighters didn't follow his prescription because I had him low carb to get him to weight. We did a water cut, all that kind of stuff. He got to weight, then he didn't follow my prescription. So he didn't replenish. He didn't eat his carbs. He didn't get, recompensated for the event. Guess what? He did brilliantly, and he fought better than he previously had. So now, when he's dieting for fights, he just goes low carb and fights low carb.
Wow.
But it's only like professional Muay Thai. It's like 3 threes,
Right.
kind of thing. It's not a long event. Are you going to exhaust your glycogen even going really hard for 9 minutes?
And it's probably not your standard client either. Like
no.
Yeah, he's not. That's not less like a.
Right.
Man, that's 30% of athletes.
Yeah, no, exactly. But it's interesting the outlier who we often talk about. Well, at the performance level, it's different because often when we're prescribing very low carb, we are often talking about people with pathology, whether it's with obesity, with metabolic disorder. Mm-hmm. But we see those people who are outliers in the performance setting as well. And I think that's interesting enough to recognize because if you're dealing with 100 clients, hey, 5 of them might be outliers either way, right?
Yep.
And the rest are going to fall pretty much within these general guidelines that we're all probably on the same page with.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I think another thing is that your body changes throughout a prep, whether you're cutting for Muay Thai comp or like in my case, I'm 6 weeks out, and I had zero issue going pretty low carb, moderate fat because I just have to go low calories from the start. Felt great all the way through to the point where I was just touching in a single digit body fat percentage. But right now I have glutes from the side and I have kind of that top medial glute cut. But I'm maybe
Show us.
I love how Eric mentions
real
that
quick.
everyone knows what that means for a bodybuilder. Oh, you got the glute cut. Oh, he's 10%.
Yeah, he's close. Yeah, so I'm probably 2 kilos over stage weight, or like the low weigh-in that I'll need to hit, maybe 2, maybe 3. And I noticed that the feeling of being on lower carb intake versus refeeds now is much more. There's a bigger gap between how I feel on a refeed day versus a low day than it was even 2 kilos ago or 4 weeks ago from dieting. So I do think as you get leaner, and as you've been in a deficit longer. And things change. Like we know that when you take someone on a low-carb diet for long enough, it's actually harder for them to tap into their glycogen stores, which is some of the reason why some of that fat adaptation and carb loading just never really panned out.
Yeah.
Like we really thought we could get, maybe we should talk about that briefly, but I think some people in the research community went, hey, hold on. A low-carb diet retools your muscles really elegantly and beautifully. It's amazing. Like, wow, you can shift your fuel utilization a huge proportion. But then why didn't it work when we then loaded them with carbs? Oh, shit, it actually impaired their enzymatic activity to actually tap into glycogen and utilize it. So I think we forget that our bodies aren't static. Yeah. Our ability to handle carbohydrate and fat changes based on whether we're eating carbohydrate or fat, and it might even change based on what our body fat percentage changes happens over time and the hormonal changes that go along with being in a deficit.
Yeah. So
that's an important distinction as well. And this is something I've seen relatively consistently, is that when you start putting carbs back into a dieted bodybuilder, things happen that are pretty cool.
Yeah.
And eating up into shows and doing things like carbohydrate loading with amounts that you wouldn't expect to be effective or too high. You see a ton of case studies like that. So I think those are all things to keep in mind, that not only are there individual differences, but there's differences within individuals over time.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think that is the perfect segue now because we've been talking. I think the memory card was formatted for the audio, so we are good to go over an hour and 24 minutes, I was told, which is actually right around where we are if you take a look, Danny, where I remember the hour 25.
Yeah, we've got an extra 30 minutes now anyway.
Yeah, we have a whole extra 30 minutes. I would say there's so much more that we can talk about, but I think this was a fascinating discussion, taking a holistic look at carbohydrates related to performance. I want both of you two gents just to give any closing statements, and then also we're going to go lastly into where can people follow you, find you, all those sorts of things. So Cliff, I'll start with you. Anything from this discussion you just want to add, clarify, positions that you may have said that you, just want to add a little something to?
I think really, I'm just really interested in discovering more about this, and I hope people listening to this are as well. And I hope what that means is that when ideas that are perhaps a little bit different to what you think are presented, you go further and think about how that can be translated to maybe your own dietary strategy or how that might help your clients. And really understand that there is pretty extreme variability between individuals, and as I think we've all discussed, a lot of that is not just due to physiological factors, it's behavioral, and there's a whole bunch of other underlying stuff from ethnogenetics through to a whole range of other adaptations. So I think really the key is we've just got to experiment and treat this as fun, I think a lot of times people have lost the value of experimentation, which I felt like was a lot stronger when I got into the game. We were all just fascinated by this stuff. What's keto? Well, let's go up to Burger King and just buy a burger and throw away the buns. That's crazy, but let's try it, Did it work for you? Not really. I felt like shit. Did it work for you? Yeah, man, look at me, I'm ripped. It was rad just experimenting with stuff. So I think that's what we need to get back to is self-experimentation, because at the end of the day, that's the start of the scientific method.
And where can people find you if they want to learn more about your stuff?
People can find me at cliffharvey.com, nice and easy, and there you can spin off to my Facebook page and my podcast and the various businesses I'm involved in. So that's probably the best hub, is just go to cliffharvey.com and check out everything from there.
Awesome. And hopefully next time we have you on the podcast, you'll be Dr. Cliff Harvey, because you're very soon to submission, right?
There'll be no hopefully. I'm submitting this week, and so be all finished up by July.
Love it, man. It's
Yeah.
exciting.
Cliff Harvey, the man who we don't know why he hasn't been on Rogan yet. We can't figure it out. It's all the perfect points.
Well, I was going to throw in a Bulletproof Coffee reference, and that was going to get me on, but just didn't get it out there.
Right.
Part two.
Yeah. Danny.
So Danny, final thoughts, and where can people find you?
Sure. So I'll probably echo a lot of what Cliff just said, because that's typically the way I round things out, is that any of these discussions should be viewed as something that should enhance people's critical thinking, and as opposed to anyone trying to sell a certain position of this is what you must do. Hopefully that this conversation has probably shown there's all this different nuance and context to different applications, and just hopefully the thing I'm big on is trying to see what biases we have that we can potentially challenge. So there's probably people that are listening that have came in from different perspectives and different ends of the spectrum on this. And I think opening up to other viewpoints and seeing where's the credibility and usefulness of those other applications and why they're becoming useful and popular in certain areas is really important. And so I think there's always value in almost any particular stance. And Cliff came across the great example when we brought up the carnivore diet, that whilst a lot of the stuff out there on that is nonsensical and extremist, that doesn't mean you immediately dismiss it without thinking, well, is there anything even interesting of a question I can ask myself about it? And then from there, you might be able to work out some of the stuff that we were talking about. So that would be my final takeaway for people. Just don't be closed off to certain ideas. Try and think about where things that seem completely divergent from what you might even be interested in can apply. And be critical in how you think. And then, if people want to find me, website is sigmanutrition.com. Pretty much everything is there, articles, podcasts, so on. They can find me on social media. Instagram is just DannyLennon_Sigma. Twitter, just pop in my name, it should come up. Same Facebook, they can find the Sigma Nutrition page or my own personal account, I don't mind. And if they're into listening to podcasts, just go to Sigma Nutrition Radio and any app, and they'll be able to find it.
Awesome. Thank you both for your time. Omar, you want to close this out?
Absolutely, yeah. Just before we go, Eric, I didn't tell you before we started, but we got our first sponsor. I know this is probably actually our 6th episode, which is cool. I want to thank Cliff and Danny. I didn't I didn't ask for permission because I know we're in perfect simpatico and perfect harmony. I just want to thank Wonder
You know it,
Bread.
brother.
Wonder Bread fuels your performance. It gives you the good, clean carbs that you need in order to be the most anabolic that you can. Wonder Bread is the carbohydrate of champions. So I know Cliff would endorse that, Danny, Eric.
Yeah.
Just look at that bicep peak right there. So I want to thank both of these guests for being on. Make sure to check out. It's going to be linked if you're watching on YouTube in the description, as well on iTunes. Further information with them. We're back every single Monday. Iron Culture, the podcast. Eric Helms, Koth Eric, and myself, the Surf Clam. You could help us out by leaving a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out. We'll see everyone on that Monday episode.